Hello, my name's Patricia, and this is the Poetry Pcast. Welcome back, or if this is your first time here, welcome. Where have you been? Personally, I'm just back from Malaysia, where I spent a wonderful 2 weeks with some of my family exploring the countryside. We worked our way down from the island of Langkawi to a final few days in one of the world's biggest islands, Borneo. We loved our stay, but if we had to pick out the absolute highlights, they would be the food, which because of the disparate population is diverse and extremely tasty, and the island of Borneo, where we spent our time travelling along the Kinabatangan River in the company of Erdi, who, bless him, found so many species of native animals for us to marvel at, including pygmy elephants, which are typically elusive. So we were absolutely thrilled. I'll put a link to the company we used in case anyone else is thinking of going to Malaysian Borneo. We can't recommend them enough. They were really great and went above and beyond for us. And I think I'm definitely going to go back to Borneo and see more of the island. Anyway, this does sort of have a bearing on this week's podcast, honest. I want to introduce the theme for this year's anthology to you. Little Marvels, our annual anthology, will be on the theme of belonging and alienation. Speaking of belonging, if you want to be in the anthology, you need to sign up for our newsletter, as it's by invitation only, and only people who get the newsletter will be invited. Now, Malaysia appears to be a great example of a country which has welcomed a diversity of migrating populations and formed a fairly cohesive population in which these diverse groups seem to belong. Of course, I'm the alien in this case, so I might not have picked up on underlying tensions, but to the outsider like myself, things look like they work swimmingly, and all the various cultural and ethnic groups belong. To get us going this week, let me read you some haiku by Malaysian poets, one of whom we know quite well. First up, a couple by Ramesh Anand, which I found on the Akita International website. Rice fields, bent woman reaping gossip. Rice fields, bent woman reaping gossip. I admit I didn't see any rice fields, but I was in the Cameron Highlands where they grow tea, and I could perhaps swap this to being fields of tea, bent woman reaping gossip. The next one of Ramesh's poems. Monsoon ends, the lake filling into emptiness. Monsoon ends, the lake filling into emptiness. This next one speaks to me of Kuala Lumpur, where we spent some lovely evenings in rooftop gardens and bars, seeking wonderful sunsets. Rooftop garden, the sound of traffic far below. Rooftop garden, the sound of traffic far below. And that's by Jeff Leong, and I found it on the Haiku Foundation's Haiku Dialogue from October 2017. And now for a poet that we definitely know, Christina Chin. Lingering fragrance of a civet cat, mango season. Lingering fragrance of a civet cat, mango season. And I found that at Akita International. Dark moon, a scorpion claws through the thatched roof. Dark moon, a scorpion claws through the thatched roof. And Christina wrote that for us at Poetry P, and it was in the journal 122. Thankfully, I didn't have any scorpions in my room, although we did find some on a jungle walk in Borneo. Now, before I go on, let me remind you that this month, February 2025, is a submission month. Sci-fi coup. And I need your submissions by the 15th, please, if you want to be considered for the first journal of this year. And of course, the podcast. If you're coming late to the party, check out the submission pages of the website. There's almost always something going on. And now back to the anthology. Since I chose this topic, I've noticed that other publications and competitions have also come up with a theme. So I thought I'd tell you why I chose it. And over the coming months, I'll be exploring various sub-themes of belonging and alienation to inspire you to write. And perhaps you'll email me with more ideas to broaden out the scope of the topic. I'd really like us to push ourselves and create something special. Back in September, Zurich in Switzerland, where I live, had its annual Long Night of the Museums, a night when, for a special price, you can visit a number of Zurich's museums well into the early hours of the morning. In truth, I've never made it much past midnight, but you can. They have a website, which I'll put in the show notes if you're ever this way when it's happening. And of course, as it's a Swiss website, you'll find it in many languages, including English. One of the museums I wanted to visit was the Ethnographic Museum because it had an exhibition of some of the Benin bronzes, and I'd never seen them. Despite the British Museum having an extensive collection, and I've spent countless hours in the British Museum in my time, as it's not far from my alma mater, University College London. If you don't know what the bronzes are and where they're from, well, Benin is now in Nigeria, and these bronzes, to quote the British Museum, are a group of sculptures which include elaborately decorated cast relief plaques, commemorative heads, animal and human figures, items of royal regalia, and personal ornaments. They were created from at least the 1500s onwards in the West African kingdom of Benin by a specialist guild working for the royal court of the Oba, as the king is called, in Benin City. A significant number of these bronzes were created for ancestral altars of the rulers. They were often used in the rituals of accession and provide the world with an historic record of Benin, its customs, its society, its relationship with the outside world, both other African kingdoms and, at that stage, with Europe. How did these bronzes find their way out of Benin? Colonialism. And before you jump to the conclusion that the British were totally to blame, and in truth, they pretty much were in this case, I'd like to put things in a bit of context. During 1884 and 5, a conference of 13 European nations and the US took place in Germany, in which an agreement regulating European colonization and trade in Africa during the new imperialism period was reached. Many people see this as Europe dividing Africa amongst the various European powers. I'm not sure I'm qualified to comment on that. But the result, anyway, was called the General Act of Berlin. Britain had been involved in trade with Benin for some time, at least from the mid-1850s, I believe. Anyway, Benin was an independent state at the time of the General Act of Berlin. Britain had trade agreements with it, but it seems there was pressure from various interested parties to incorporate Benin into the British Empire. No surprise then that the relationship between the British and the royal family of Benin did not always run smoothly. It's complicated, and of course this is a poetry podcast, not a history one, although I know it often heads in that direction. So I'm not going to go into great detail. If you'd like to read up on the topic, I'll put some easily accessible links in the show notes. Anyway, things between Britain and Benin came to a head in 1897 when a British vice consul in the area took a party to Benin to negotiate with its ruler, with the Oba. the British were massacred. And you can imagine Britain was not going to take that lying down. And of course, they sent a punitive force to Benin, a force of approximately 5,000 men. You can probably imagine the results. And in the process of the British offensive, Benin was looted and many bronzes were taken and sold to various museums and private collectors. The Swiss bronzes I saw in the museum were sold to a private collector living in Switzerland. And that, in a nutshell, is how I was able to see the bronzes in a Swiss museum. If you're wondering if any of the bronzes have been returned, the answer is yes, some have. And many institutions are in discussion with the Nigerian authorities about returning more. But therein lies a problem. Who are they going to return them to? Do they go to the ruler of Benin, the current Oba, who maintains he is the owner of the bronzes, and they might be kept in the royal palace and nobody see them? Or do these bronzes belong to the larger population of Benin? In which case, do they go to the National Commission for Museums and Monuments, which is Nigeria's federal body in charge of its heritage, an organisation that might make sure that the bronzes are available for all the population to see? Looted treasure. School children learn of their nation's past. Looted treasure. School children learn of their nation's past. That's one by me, and it's unpublished because I thought I'd write a few haiku and senryu just for this podcast. I'm sure, though, when it comes to it, you're going to do better than me. When I was writing this verse, I was thinking of the British Museum, chock full of treasures from different parts of the world, and children who are perhaps learning about how these treasures came to be in the museum. But I suppose other people might hear it and think it could be about looted treasure that returns home, and children of the home nation are doing the learning. Anyway, I don't want to give the impression that the British are the only nation that looted from other countries. The Rosetta Stone was originally found in Egypt by the French, although it does now live in the British Museum. The Bangor Queen of Cameroon was looted by the Germans, and through a number of subsequent moves has ended up in France, owned by the Dapper Foundation. And Yale University in the US took possession of a number of articles from Machu Picchu in Peru. They were loath to give them back, but eventually the artifacts made their way to a university in Cuzco. As you can probably tell, my visit to the museum got me thinking. Got me thinking about a lot of things. First off, about where do these looted artifacts belong? And I wondered if you might have something to say about that in your poetry. Do you have something to say about artifacts you've seen in your home museums or your own country somewhere that speak to you of belonging? And also, you might possess historical pieces that contribute to your sense of belonging. I know I do. Spring buds, Mum's African violet in Grandma's milk jug. Spring buds, Mum's African violet in Grandma's milk jug. One of my most precious possessions is, in fact, my grandmother's milk jug. It's not valuable in any monetary sense, but it's priceless to me as it connects me to generations of my family. And I hope to pass it on to a member of my family who might appreciate that. She was rather fond of African violets, and I had to look them up because I'm not a big lover of them. Did you know that they can live for 50 years? Amazing. While I was at the Ethnographic Museum, I met and spoke with a couple of students. One student had migrated to Switzerland from Africa with her parents as a young child and grown up here. Another was the son of an African father and Swiss mother, and had been born and raised here in Switzerland. We spoke together about belonging, and where they thought they belonged. As a child of migrants, and a migrant myself, I was really interested to hear their thoughts. The migrant student likened belonging to being a pot plant. She'd been transplanted to Switzerland as a young child, grown up in foreign soil, in a climate that was not her own, and yet she had thrived, despite certain difficulties along the way. And as she spoke, she reminded me of a moth orchid. I've seen them growing happily in their natural surroundings in a garden of a hotel in Battambang in Cambodia. But surely many of us have one in our house. And most of these houses are in places where the orchids wouldn't occur naturally. I have one. I've had many. I'm renowned in my family for killing them. I like to think I give them too much love. And as I sit here recording this for you, I'm looking at the latest. It's looking quite good at the moment. Fingers crossed, it'll bloom again. It's been trying to do that for quite some time. Dark green leaves of Phalaenopsis orchids, low winter light. Dark green leaves of Phalaenopsis orchids, low winter light. It's another one of my unpublished ones, and yes, my orchid has leaves that are perhaps a little bit too dark. C'est la vie. Spring will be here in the not too distant future, and maybe things will brighten up. The other student was much less positive about where he belonged, and it was clear he felt some alienation in his mother's country. And to stay with botanical poetry, perhaps he felt a little bit like this. Bitterly cold winter, Fuchsia Magellanica Ricartonii withers and dies. Bitterly cold winter, Fuchsia Magellanica Ricartonii withers and dies. Another one by me. I know I'm always banging on about specificity. I wonder, though, is that a bit too specific? But going back to my grandmother, her garden was full of this type of fuchsia. My mother's too, as they reminded her of her home. And in London, I had no problem growing them in my garden. But here in Switzerland, well, I think the poem says it all. I keep trying, though, because if I have a fuchsia and some potatoes growing, I feel like I have a connection to my roots. But going back to my student friend, perhaps this one is more suitable. Summer bedding, the only yellow trumpet in the flower bed. Summer bedding, the only yellow trumpet in the flower bed. Another one I wrote just for this podcast. And did you know the yellow trumpet is the national flower of Nigeria? And you can find it on its coat of arms. Thinking of my young friend, Switzerland has a population that's really quite white. And so I imagine that my young friend might well have felt like the only yellow trumpet in the flower bed. Alienation. Let's think about that element of the anthology in another podcast. Of course, you don't have to follow my lead with botanical references to illustrate how you belong or how you feel alienated. I leave it up to you to find your own way. But as a result of my conversations in the museum, I began to think about where I belong. How do I know I belong? The simplest answer to that might be that I belong at home. I belong to my family. I belong to various hobby groups. But it's really not that simple. As I thought about it, I found that I have a very complicated relationship with home and belonging. If someone asks me where home is or where I belong, I'm hard-pressed to tell them. Or maybe I tell them that I have many homes. Ireland, London, Switzerland. In fact, I was having just that sort of conversation with someone in Kuala Lumpur the other week who asked me that very question, where did I belong? Surely, she said, it's where you're born. And I thought about it for a minute and said, no, I'm not entirely sure that it is. Isn't life complicated? So another strand of your poetry might involve place names, places where you belong. Crystal Palace Park, a kaleidoscope of colour, dripping ice cream. Crystal Palace Park, a kaleidoscope of colour, dripping ice cream. Another one of my unpublished ones. This might give us another opportunity to write poetry including place names, as we did in Series 4, Episode 18. Link in the show notes. And I thought I'd bring us some poetry from that episode, which I think fit the bill for belonging. Dad casts again. In our bucket, the wild smell of Lake Minnewanna. Dad casts again. In our bucket, the wild smell of Lake Minnewanna. Nick Hoffman, Poetry P Podcast, S4E18. Pitch black night. Turtles flip talang-talang's soft white sand. Pitch black night. Turtles flip talang-talang's soft white sand. And that's by Christina Chin again, from the same podcast, and giving me another reason why I have to go back to Malaysia. Mumbai local. A rainbow halts at the platform for a minute. Mumbai local. A rainbow halts at the platform for a minute. Alvinda Kaur. Poetry P Podcast, S4E18. Catskill Mountain Dew. My whole life contained within these peaks and valleys. Catskill Mountain Dew. My whole life contained within these peaks and valleys. Sorry Grandstuff, Poetry P Podcast, S4E18. I think that one clearly speaks of belonging, don't you? I continue to mull over the question of belonging, possibly coming to some sort of conclusion. As a migrant, from a family of migrants, I have to feel rooted to belong. Perhaps we all do. And unlike Sari, my roots might not be in place, but with my family. Wild dog roses rampant in the hedgerows, summer residence. Wild dog roses rampant in the hedgerows, summer residence. That one speaks of my summer holidays when I'd go home to Ireland to spend time on the farm. Shriveled leaf, the mirror catches my father's face. Shriveled leaf, the mirror catches my father's face. I was inspired to write that one by a photo I was looking at recently. The older I get, hence the shriveled leaf, the more like my father I look. Grandpa's hen house on the path through the pines. Komoribai. Grandpa's hen house on the path through the pines. Komoribai. That's actually one of my published ones. It was in Geppo in November 2021. Dew-wet grass, following the snail trail of Granny's wellies. Dew-wet grass, following the snail trail of Granny's wellies. Had that one published in Frameless Sky, issue 18. It's about following my grandmother out to find the cows to bring them in for milking. As I ponder my own belonging, I'm getting really excited to read your poems. Make sure you're signed up to the mailing list so you don't miss your opportunity to submit. I'll have more podcasts to inspire you, some to encourage you to think about alienation too. But remember, if you do have thoughts on belonging and alienation, I want to hear from you. So until next week, when I hope you'll join me for more poetry, keep writing. And don't forget, there are some links for you to follow up the context of today's podcast if you'd like to know more about the Benin bronzes. And of course, if you're thinking of going to Borneo, I have that recommendation for you too. Ciao!